Good afternoon, everybody. Lovely to see you, and wonderful to be here with Garry, having seen this magnificent production. It really is extraordinary. Those of you who've seen it will know what I'm talking about, and those of you who haven't, I'm sure the anticipation is great and quite justified. I think my favourite cartoon of all time was from Dublin Opinion magazine in I think it was in the 40s or early 50s. And it shows two formidable-looking Dublin working-class women squaring up against each other. And one of them is saying to the other one, she's saying, look here, Mrs. Murphy, we'll have none of your Abbey Theatre realism in this here tenement. And I've always loved it because it captures, in a way, that sort of interpenetration of drama and life, you know, particularly in those working-class communities throughout a lot of the 20th century. My wife taught in the inner city for years, and the kids still use the term, you know, if somebody's acting up a bit, say, don't mind her, she's only an Abbey actor. You know, it's still very much that sort of awareness of this. But, and I mean, so far as I know, the very first idea for the Irish Citizen Army, which features so powerfully, of course, in the Plough and the Stars, was articulated by the playwright Bernard Shaw at a meeting in London where he shared a platform with James Connolly. And Connolly's announcement of the formation of the Citizen Army was in his newspaper, The Irish Worker, and the headline that Connolly chose for it is Arms and the Man, which of course is a Shaw play. And then, of course, the first secretary of the Citizen Army is John O'Casey, who then subsequently creates these extraordinary works. And we were just talking beforehand, and neither of us can think of a parallel that I know of in any other country, right, where you have work of such scale and such theatrical importance being created so close to the revolutionary events that create a state. I just don't think there is anything else like it. It is astonishing to remember that the first of these plays is 1923, when in many ways the conflict is still going on, and that the last of them is 1926, which is the 10th anniversary of the 1916 Rising that it's set among. So it's this closeness that is unique, I think, and there's this paradox, though, I think, that these plays are also, or were for a long time, perhaps overperformed. They became a kind of staple, particularly for the Abbey. Yeah. If they couldn't think of doing anything else, they put on the Plough and the Stars.
Or if they needed money.
They needed money. They were stuck, yeah. Something, or if they were doing something which wasn't working and it was failing, the company could always throw together another Plough and the Stars or another Juno. So they became almost kind of disrespected, I think, in this kind of overfamiliarity. The extraordinary thing about these productions is that it feels like you're seeing them for the first time. It feels like they are urgent, they are vivid, they're of the moment, and it's the recapturing of that, I think, which is such an astonishing achievement. But you can't not but be aware of this sort of encrusted legacy of O'Casey in Ireland, and was that part of your thinking about this project?
I think the central part of my thinking about the project was to do the three together. Yeah. And I thought it was a great idea. I had never heard of it being done, and then we formally researched it to try and see had it been done in Germany or Russia or something. It hadn't been done, and as you know, it really is the most natural of the trilogies of work we've done. While O'Casey didn't write them as a trilogy, he did say that when he sat down to write what was to become Plough and the Stars, he did know it was going to be written in he's going to be set in 1916, and therefore he did know that he would, at the end of it, have written a trilogy.
Yeah. I mean, I remember talking to you about this, I mean, probably going back to the early 1990s. Yeah. And so I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this is a project that's been on your mind for 30 years.
Yes.
Why has it taken so long?
lot of reasons. You know, just the whole idea of doing events like this. We only started to do it in 2005 with Druid Sing, and then with Martin McDonough's plays as well. And the Druid Sing project was postponed for a number of years because of, for money reasons, to try and raise money. And then the O'Casey project would have been, for me, the natural next one. But there were difficulties acquiring the rights, and we couldn't get the rights. And that meant, really, as far as I was concerned, that it wouldn't happen at all. But in fact, sort of unexpectedly, a few years ago, you know, I learned that it was possible to acquire the rights now. And so... I mean, but perhaps there is a certain advantage to that, in that... I suppose one can see that there's a huge amount of distillation, of thought about these plays, and also the experience of doing the other big multi-play projects. Everything seems to come to fruition with this. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we, you know, in terms of something like this, there's huge teams of people from the company of actors, the creative team, the crew, technical, sales, producing, and we have a team now who are practiced and know what is involved and can anticipate what's involved. So, you know, it makes it from the first experience of doing Druid Sing, which was really one of the most scariest things of my life, to now where it's scary, all right, but you sort of know you've done it before and that it can be done at least.
I presume you never conceived of it as anything other than playing them not chronologically as written, but chronologically in terms of when they're set. That was always...
No, I did, actually. And in fact, for a while, I was quite wedded to the idea that they would be done in order of how they were written, because I believed seeing O'Casey's work, seeing him grow as a writer over the three plays would be very interesting for our audiences and for ourselves, until a member of the acting company said to me, do you really want to do a trilogy of O'Casey's and end up with two Tommies on the stage singing Keep the Home Fires Burning? No. So.
I mean, it is an astonishing development. I mean, there's a unity to the plays as a trilogy, but it's also mind-boggling to look at The Shadow of a Gunman and think about, it's only 3 years later you've got The Plough and the Stars. And you're moving from a very, very simple piece, which is almost like an extended one act, to an extraordinarily sophisticated theatrical spectacle, which is using so many different techniques, which is pushing away from realism into almost a kind of surrealist, almost sometimes you think about anticipating Samuel Beckett, you know.
Absolutely.
And it's an amazing creative development. So I can see where the attraction of just showing that might have been. But if you do it this way, one of the things that has a big effect on, of course, is it helps a lot with Shadow of a Gunman, doesn't it? Which is the weakest of the three plays, but actually it gains a lot from being in this context.
I think it does. And, you know, I mean, even to the point that some time early in the rehearsals, it became clear that we would be able to do it without an interval. And I thought that's just perfect, because that takes like 20, 25 minutes off the whole day, which makes life a lot easier for the audiences. But, I mean, I have done a single production of both of the other plays in very different circumstances, but I've never done Shadow, and I've sort of found Shadow rather fascinating, actually. And so it's like that kind of thing, the run to the litter, you know, you sort of like, it's still, you know, it's the characters he creates, both the two leading characters of Shields and Davern, and then the characters who come in and out the door. I wouldn't have minded it being a first play of mine if I had been a writer.
Yeah.
And it's a lot better than a lot of other first plays, although it wasn't his first play as such, but his first play to be accepted for production.
Yeah. I mean, apart from anything else, it is a great example of why playwrights need to be produced and why the theatre and a connection with the theatre matters so much, because, as you say, he had written lots of plays which had been rejected, and it's the experience of having that play put on that then allows this extraordinary development to happen, doesn't it? So, so there's lots of things I want to ask you about. One of them is I suppose the general aesthetic approach, because the more you look at O'Casey, the harder he is to categorize, you know.
Yes.
I suppose he was thought about for a long time as a sort of realism, and undoubtedly there are elements in the plays which are brutal in terms of their exposure of poverty, destitution, disease, violence, you know, mental illness. You know, you can go on. Alcoholism, for example.
Yes.
We start in this production, I was thinking, you know, we're talking about the inner city of Dublin now and heroin epidemics and all the rest of it, you know, and you start with a guy who's trying to give up the drink. And we kind of suspect it's not going to succeed, right? You know, so at that level, all that stuff is there and is very potently present. But they don't feel like pieces of realism either, you know, and there's so much poetry in it. There's so much song, farce, music hall, you know, as I said, surrealism you often end up with. So I just wondered, you were thinking about these as a unity, right, as you know, as a trilogy, but where's the aesthetic unity? How do you find a way of saying all these mad elements that this guy's keeping together? How am I going to make something that is convincing, that can move between all those elements and keep all those balls in the air at the same time?
And really, I'd say that all of those questions that you're asking there would have been questions I would have asked myself, and Francis and I, and the general design team would have discussed many times, because we had a long time to design these plays. I would say that, first of all, just when you read the plays, you realise how deeply he's buried his dramaturgical weapons, so that people come indoors all the time. In fact, Shadow is about people coming indoors. And so therefore, straight away, my experience tells me that if there's supposed to be a door there and it's supposed to reveal the actor coming through, put a door there. Yeah. Because if you don't, then the whole rhythm of the play is going to be crashed through if you see the person approaching the door, or I've seen so many actors trying to pretend going through a door when they're just walking out of space, and it's terrifying. So that became clear then, that we would observe, if you like, the ground plan of the ground plan that he laid out, not obviously to a T, but that we would preserve that. And then the second point became about, you know, what material were we going to do what he asked for, which is to set them in a Georgian-built tenement. And I'd spent so much time looking at that I eventually, it was really almost personal, in the sense if I look at another Georgian tenement again, I'll think I'll throw up. And as well as that, whenever I looked at them, I thought I would love to have a flat in town with just a mattress and those beautiful walls and those high ceilings, etc. So it began a process to use a material, and also that when the plays were presented first, and for many years, for many decades, the tenement was a live notion. It was there. There were tenements. Now, I doubt there are many people who remember tenements in any real sense. No. And I just thought, well, then maybe it's the time to see, will these plays work without the support of the tenement experience?
Yeah.
And that really, those two things were the basis of the design.
I mean, that was obviously very much on your mind when you did the, I think, magnificent Plough and the Stars in the Abbey in 1991, was
yeah.
You know, which went very far in terms of breaking those frames.
Yeah.
And, you know, I vividly remember, I don't know if you remember, but I remember in the green room at the opening night of that play, Gay Byrne getting me in a corner and poking my chest saying, "Flute are good is not like that." You know, and he was deeply in a rage. I mean, all the sort of suavity of Gay Byrne, you know, that this was just such an outrageous thing to do because we know these people and we know these places, and you can't do that. It's sort of sacrilegious to play around with this stuff.
There's a lot of people who've had that.
And there really were, yeah. And I wondered, was it important for you to, that in a way, having gone very far with that you felt you don't need to go that far. You can come back in a way to think about, as you say, the kind of grand plan that OKC has for you, the sort of space that's there.
Yeah, I to be honest with you, it's one of the things I must do when I get a bit of free time is go into the Abbey archive and look at the photographs. I only remember bits of that production. I do remember how we handled the speaker with the mirror, which the audience saw themselves in. And I do remember the British flag at the end. But so therefore, it absolutely wasn't in my mind at all, other than for me and the then set designer, Frank Conway, it was exactly that. It was asking ourselves, can this play be presented with all of the accoutrements, without all of the accoutrements that have grown up around it, especially in the Abbey after decades and decades of production.
Because one of the things that's so wonderful in these productions is, in one way, the space is sort of conventional in the sense that we can kind of imagine it as these rooms. But on the other side, as an audience, we never take the space for granted. It's always problematic. It's problematic because we've got these, walls that we are always aware of as walls because they recur and move and take different shapes. So they actually they become a force within the play itself. And that seemed to me to be really on the money in terms of what O'Casey's doing, how he's thinking about space. So you're talking about his dramaturgy, and again, I think he's patronized this sort of working class, uneducated playwright, and you think about what he's doing, starting the Plough and the Stars with the door. It's not just there is a door there. There's a guy trying to fix the lock on the door. Why is he trying to fix the lock on the door? Because the woman of the house wants the bloody door to be lockable, to stop people coming in, to keep the world out. And of course, it's not working. He's fixing the door, but everybody keeps coming in.
Absolutely.
And just those simple, apparently simple things. And then of course the extraordinary denouement of Juno, where the stage is populated with a new stage set is created and then dismantled. And you think about all these things, and then his use of the outdoor spaces, the street, the pub. I mean, he has an incredibly complex idea of theatrical space, doesn't he?
Absolutely, and that he's capable of that. He puts 4 acts into Plough and the Stars, and he says that it's what I call it the famous coda, where he brings in the curtain. Now, he may have done at the time just brought it in for the practical reasons that he wanted all the other furniture gone. He accomplished some of the furniture being brought out in stage time, but he couldn't get everything out. So the curtain comes in, and then it reveals what he's actually written is that it reveals Mary and Juno side by side at the fire in an empty room, which is brilliant. But in terms of the particular metaphor that we were using, where you could clearly see from the very beginning that these were flats.
Yeah.
And that they were porous. They didn't work. And, even down to using the stage weights that were used for steadying flats, painted in Francis's favourite orange, bright orange colour, to then have the last scene set where the very obvious flats are now there, but we just see the back of them. Yeah. We see them from the point of view of all the actors who would be in the wings, the technical thing. That's to me, that's Francis's particular vision, and I just loved it.
Yeah. The other thing with the space is that is managing to make it a multi-layered space, which works extraordinarily well. At what stage did you think, with the design, thinking about those moments when we open, as an audience, again, we start seeing the stairs.
Yeah.
We start seeing the, as you say, the porousness of the set itself, but also getting this, again, this claustrophobic sense that these people are literally living on top of each other.
Well, I'll tell you, accidents are always part of the artistic process, and in this case it was as well. As I said, we were a long time designing it, and Francis originally created a much more traditional set. And as part of that traditional set were the stairs, beautifully period stairs with the indentations from thousands and thousands of feet, and so on and so forth. Then we decided, no, we're not going that way. And months later, another model emerges, which is more or less what you see in front of you. But as we were looking at this model, the stairs from the other set was just hanging around beside the model. And suddenly both of us started playing with the stairs. So the stairs got admission into the space by virtue of the fact that it was just adjacent there on his desk when he was presenting the second model. As soon as we said, what would happen if we dropped these in? And suddenly that became a measure of it. And sorry.
No, well, just that it's incredibly effective, I think, for an audience. I'm sure people have seen it, where the reveal of the stairs at different points where we suddenly we're reminded that it's not just this kind of flat space that we're in. We're also in this vertical space, because that's the way the tenement life was. And that's right. This multi-layer. Of course, it works very well in the street scene as well with Bessie.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, roaring out at them and all that.
Yeah.
One of the advantages of starting with the Plough, and again, it's just the freshness of it. It's very obvious. Anybody seen the play or read the play, it. But it just came across with such force, which is that how immediately we're into a whirlwind of conflict. I mean, it's hard to think of a play where, even the sort of opening banter, which is sort of vaguely comic, but it's also
has an edge to it.
Has an edge to it because this woman's private. She's got a hat delivered, right, and Mrs. Gogan is opening the box, putting on the hat.
She debases the hat before.
Everything is sort of touched by somebody else. Yeah. So even that, but then immediately we're into Uncle Peter and the Covey, and it's all knockabout farce, but it's just a world in which there are no still moments. I mean, even the sort of sexual scenes, between Jack and Nora, constant the tension is
eruptions,
always there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And again, I wonder, having directed so many plays, can you think of anything quite like that where you're just not given any time to adjust yourself to the level at which these people are operating? It just seems like there's an electricity running through it from the very start.
Yeah, I think parts of O'Casey, to me, they may not be to other directors, are notoriously difficult. And that first act of Plough would be one of them. Yeah. Because, even the whole thing, like one of the things we struggled about way early in the rehearsals was, obviously Fluther was there repairing the door, that's not a problem, but who is Ginny Gogan?
Yeah.
And because she and he occupied the stage for the first 10 minutes, but the audience got to learn that they are not the people who live in this room, they are neighbours and so on and so forth. And, you know, it proves very difficult, particularly when Sean was so, you know, he just said, you're actors, you act it. Because he gives Ginny Gogan acres and acres of backstory to dump at you, the audience, so he then can get on and write the play he wants to write. Those things are difficult, you know, for a cast and for a cast generally. You know, and you have to show it's a tenement and it's a poor place, but Nora has lifted it a bit because she does not want to be, you know, part of that life. She wants out of it. She wants, and if she can't get out of it, at least she won't live a tenement life in the tenement. She lives some other kind of life. Tragically, of course, it breaks her mind.
It struck me, this is a slight diversion, but maybe not too much of one, that so many of the great productions you've done of Irish plays are all about the same thing, you know, which is somebody trying to set up a conventional nuclear family and failing. You know, that if you go back to the John B. Keane plays that you've done, you know, with Sive, King of the Castle, you know, you look at this over and over and over, Whistle in the Dark, you know, starting with, you know, somebody's gone off to England to just, you know, man, wife, let's have kids, let's, you know, have the ordinary household. And it is an extraordinary business, isn't it, that in a culture which sees itself through the family, a constitution that talks about the family as the foundational unit of society, and you look at our drama, where all these attempts to just do the thing of forming a nuclear family, that seems impossible to do.
That seems impossible. Yeah. And one of the things that struck me about all that is, like, and it depends on probably what type of person you are, but, you know, like I do remember in conversations with the cast, there'd be people who saying, well, it's so much better, Juno, the child will have two mothers and she has now left him finally, and Mary will have the protection and the baby will have two mothers. And I just cannot go with that optimism. All I see, what they're facing is this awful state that is going to be constructed, where the church is going to run everything, and where people like Mary and her baby are thrown on a scrap heap, quite literally. And so after all this fighting, these deaths, these terrible things that people endure, for me, at the end of Juno, it's for what? Yeah. For worse. Like, you know, we were colonised first by the English state, and we're colonised afterwards then by the church. And it's only in my lifetime that we've managed to throw that over.
It always strikes me as one of the tragedies of O'Casey's betrayal by the Abbey, and I think that's too strong a word. He was betrayed when they refused to put on another play that you've done so brilliantly, the Silver Tassie, which in a way is also part of this story. He was very deliberately saying, okay, I've done this trilogy, but what about the other war, the big war, the great war? That's also so much part of the experience of these communities. But the other play that he never wrote, and that is almost implied in this trilogy, is his play about the 1913 lockout. Yeah. Because I don't think you can quite understand these people without realizing they are a defeated people, right? They were the risen people in 1913. Yeah. I mean, that struggle was really fought in those tenements as well. Yeah. They were the people who were being organized by Jim Larkin. They were the people who saw some chance of dignity and some chance of, you know, through the Union, you know, a new Ireland was coming and they were going to stake their place in it. And this wasn't the Brits. Yes. It wasn't the Brits who did it. It was the Irish ruling class, you know, in waiting, who made sure to sort this out before the state is established. Right? Just sort of, you're going to be on the bottom, you know. No matter what happens, you're going to be on the bottom. And it's sort of haunting because there are these, you know, you've got this kind of weird figure of the Covey, who, again, so I think it's one of O'Casey's most brilliant pieces of dramaturgy, which is a sort of, the O'Casey figure in all of this is the Covey, who, I was going to use the W word, but he's not,
Banker.
He's a wanker. I mean, he is. Isn't he? I mean, he really is. He's just, so he has all the ideas. He has all the ideas that O'Casey himself really believes.
Yeah.
He is the socialist. He is saying, look, this is the wrong revolution,
Yeah.
And he talks about the labour movement and what did you ever do for the labour movements, which is all kind of, in a way, kind of harking back to 1913. And Flute, talking about getting the bang on his head,
Hollow.
the hollow on his head, There's these little moments of it. But it's all become sort of useless and farcical. And again, I was just thinking about how you approach characters like that, because the elements of caricature and self-caricature, brutal self-caricature, is so strong in it.
Yeah.
How is it possible for somebody like Marty to make a character, make somebody that we actually also believe in as a person on stage?
Well, I think there's a couple of things there. I think going back to the design, again, that was part of this sense that if we kept the set plain, which practically we had to in the sense we're going to have to change throughout one day, but if we kept it plain, then we could be rich with the characters, rich with the costumes, rich with these people, because they jump out more against a plain surface that was just there to present them, not there for any other architectural reasons. I think then the Covey is called the young Covey, and although you never trust any nickname anybody ever gets in Ireland, he is usually played by a young actor, an actor in his 20s or early 30s. Marty's in his 40s. Yeah. And Marty and I were very conscious, about that. I think it really helps, because then instead of seeing him as a young fella who will change, you think if this guy is the way he is, like he is the boar that if you see coming into a pub, you just run and run and run. And I think with Marty playing him, it allows that to be very strong.
Absolutely. And it makes the conflict between himself and Uncle Peter even worse in a way, because
even worse,
this is where you really realise why you can almost see Samuel Beckett in the audience watching.
You really can.
As a young man, and his love for O'Casey, which is often kind of, I didn't think of those kind of total opposites, but I mean, he learned so much from O'Casey, and that these sort of characters who are just locked in this constant, idiotic, meaningless, endless repetition of this conflict and nastiness, and it's just going nowhere.
Well, that's it, because part of the action of the trilogy is if the violence of what's going on in the street is far away initially, it fast starts to come into the house. Yeah. But anyhow, there's wars in the house that are nearly more vicious than anything going on outside. I mean, O'Casey says that when Peter lifts the sword, he does not intend to use it on Covey. Well, I'm not sure when Covey sees that thing being swept in front of him. This is an old man. He could easily take a slice off the side of his head. So,
Two things I want to ask you about in particular. One is tone. So one of the things I thought was extraordinary in what you achieve, I think we're all used to the idea that, okay, tragicomedy or comic tragedy, whatever, is the mode, that O'Casey's working in, and it's very Shakespearean, and we have complete knockabout farce, and then we have heartbreaking tragedy. But actually what you revealed, I think, in these plays is that, the line between them is incredibly thin. Mm-hmm. It's not like Shakespeare where you have, Duncan is murdered, and then we're going to have a comic episode with the porter and the knocking on the gate, the clown comes on. It's not like that at all. That actually the interweaving is just so incredibly tight. Any previous productions I've seen always try to separate them out. Always try to say, okay, we've had the laughs now, here's the serious bit. And you don't do that. And in particular, with the Shadow of a Gunman, you keep the farce going all the way through, even when we're realizing, oh shit, this is really serious. I mean, this young girl has now been murdered. You know, has been killed. And I just wondered how you got to the sense yourself that it was possible to do that. You know, that sort of just maintaining this very uncertain tone for the audience all the time, where we don't quite know whether we're laughing or crying.
Well, there's only one answer to that: actors.
Yeah.
And actors who are capable of doing that, actors who are capable of understanding that, of finessing that, of working at that. That truly is that's the battering ram I went into the productions with. I mean, you know, like the thing that has long bothered me is the description of the plays as pieces of naturalism or realism, or nobody really knows what those terms mean in theatre anyhow. But I think that simply because his people, his characters were poor people, that the rest of the world decided, well, that it was naturalism because they have feelings, that they have the same feelings as kings and queens of prior theatre. And I think it's to see that that those normal things of life can rest in one person, like somebody like the captain, you know, when Jerry Devine is coming in and trying to get him to go out and get the job, and when he talks about, well, we can't go because of these pains in his legs, and Jerry Devine says, a bit of exercise that do you good for those pains in your leg, and he just turned around and said, you should be a doctor, Devine. And the line is a line of pure hatred at this little coming in, but of course it's very funny. Yeah. And you know, it's his two things. I think the characters he created were so great, and the situations that he made for them were so great. And then add on to that his ability to write, as for the music hall, his ability to write. We looked an awful lot at black and white, Charlie Chaplin. All of those kind of, you can see all those routines. They're there. And like, if you're going to turn around and say, well, he wrote them because that's what he was seeing in them at the time, but they're really not part of our 2023 world, then you're just throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That's the way he wrote them. And you have to find a way to do them that uses all of those things as well.
Yeah, because that was what comes across so powerfully in your production. You trust O'Casey. I mean, because he's very easy to look down on in some ways, isn't he? There's this sort of patronising view of him as naive in some ways, and you know he's using all these Boucicault stuff, and he's using stuff that he's borrowed from everywhere else, and music hall, and just sticking it all in. But as you say, that's the point. That is what the material is, and if you start trying to disentangle it, it becomes leaden.
Absolutely, it becomes nothing.
The farce just becomes kind of cheap, and the tragedy is undermined by it. Because if you haven't seen this, I mean, it's just the tragedy is just extraordinarily moving. And again, I was wondering about language as well. So, I mean, I adore O'Casey. But there is an element of overwriting. I think, you know, that he's not interested in realistic dialogue any more than Synge was, or any more than Shakespeare was, or, you know, and Murphy is, in a way, whatever. But there are certainly moments at which the alliteration, you know, the maddening, mingling memories, all that, you know, it's just too much. But again, what I thought was remarkable in these productions is how the actors found a tone for dealing with that. And I thought a lot of this was to do with finding a sort of music, a very harsh Dublin music in it, which undercuts the sort of prettiness of the poetry sometimes. And I wonder, would that also feed into your decisions about casting, because you cast a lot of very Dublin actors in it, and it you know, your own company are fantastic in it, but I think it adds hugely to it that we've got those voices in our heads all the time, and what that does to the way the language can function.
Yeah, well, I mean, accent in the theatre is always, you know, an issue, and you have professionally trained people who work with the actors, but inevitably, I think the thing that works best to create a sense of that is there are going to be some people there who are actually from Dublin. But even if you have young actors from Dublin in your company, they will start to speak contemporary working class Dublin accent, which is a drug accent and is very, very different to the accent of those times. But I think what happens is, or what I hope happens, and I've just relied on this, is that when you build a group of people together, and if you're careful, they'll start to hear each other's rhythms. And most of the actors in the company, you know, love the music and can hear the music and want to play the music. So that makes a huge difference, even at the times when you're just hanging your head and thinking, like as I said yesterday, you're thinking, Sean O'Casey never met an adjective that he didn't like.
Absolutely.
You know.
Yeah. But again, I was really struck by the fact that, you know, the temptation there might be to cut a lot of that.
Yes.
And you didn't. You know, you stuck with it.
We cut a little. We cut some of the Nora clitorosi. Because really, at a certain point, it just goes on and on.
It does. Yeah. Before I bring in the audience, I also want to, about casting, that you took big risks here. I mean, you worked with actors you haven't worked with before, and there's a lot of young actors who, well, particularly the casting of Nora, which is stunningly good. And I don't know how you feel about it, but particularly, I've always felt that two of the hardest parts in the world's play must be Nora and Johnny.
Yes.
Because they're sort of whiny, you know. They have one note, you know, and then I suppose the more traumatized they become, in a way, the higher the risk of overacting,
absolutely,
of falling over that cliff very rapidly. We've all seen productions in which you get just sick of Johnny. You just think it's a mercy when they come and shoot him. And then Nora, you know, the tragedy of Nora, it just can teeter almost into farce. And I thought in both cases, these are stunningly good performances and just are able to hold on. But, you know, it is a risk to cast people you haven't worked with before in roles that are so crucial to whether things are going to work or not.
And it is a risk, but risks like that you make in the theatre by casting young actors or any actor whom you haven't worked with before is the beautiful surprises and the beautiful things you can see that you haven't seen before. And in terms of this cast, I think I counted the 7 actors who I have never worked with before. They have worked with Druid, but I have not necessarily worked with them. And in each case, it's been a glorious experience. But Nora, you're right, Nora and Johnny are very, very difficult roles. I think Nora in particular. And this is where you do have to do a lot of hard work. You really do. The actor has to do it, the production has to do it, everybody around has to do it. It's an ask of the writing.
Well, it pays off. We've time for a couple of questions from the audience. The first hand up there, thank you very much. Do we have a mic? I don't think, we do, great, thank you. If you wouldn't mind just waiting for the mic then. Thank you very much.
I was at the 3 shows last Friday, and it's just wonderful to hear this conversation because it's brought back the experience of the entire trilogy to me again, like a week later, you know. And the thing that happened to me, you know, like you've discussed all the ins and outs, you know, and the set design and the language and everything. But when everything like that works, as it does in this, everything has to work like. So the work that's obviously gone into this by the entire Druid company is just beyond imagination, I think. But just at the end of Plough, I was sitting up at the back of the audience, and I got this real sense, it's like I was broken out of a trance, you know, at that real tragic part with Nora, which I just thought was just amazing, like how it came. that I could see that the entire audience were actually kind of moving as an organism, one organism, you know, and that has to be the kind of supreme achievement of the theatre, you know, I suppose. And that happened again and again, right throughout the whole kind of 8 hours. And it all comes up to this final, the kind of denouement, which I think is probably the message, you know, take away our hearts of stone and give us hearts of flesh. So we were taken through that emotionally, intellectually, every single thing, an entire audience working as one, you know, and you get the sense that everybody on the stage are almost like puppets of some elite that's running all this warmongering or whatever. But it's almost like then we become the kind of public accounts committee. You know, we've got a lot of public accounts, and indeed, Fintan, you've been a one-man public accounts committee in your day. But the thing is, you know, we see all that. So, you know, you mentioned, Garry, the mirror that you used, you know, in the 1991 production. Yep. But like, there was very much a sense of the audience when you get stuff of this quality on the stage that we actually become the public accounts committee. And that's the hardest thing in the world, because it's very easy to sit back and look at somebody else being on a public accounts committee. And what's at stake is absolutely massive. It's everything. And the idea that everything that O'Casey wrote 100 years ago goes right back to mythic times, the Greeks or whatever, and right up to today. You know, you're talking about being colonized by England, by religion. Like, we're colonized by technology and various other forces now. Yeah. And this speaks to that whole thing. But I just wanted to say that that's the experience. And no matter what way you look at it, an achievement like that doesn't come about without absolute massive things. So congratulations, thanks.
Well, thanks a million, Tomas. And Tomas and I soldiered on that first production in the Abbey. But I think, too, just to pick up your point, I think the thing is that first, there was a number of things. First of all, we did three, just after the pandemic, we did 3 of O'Casey's one acts, which are never done by anybody ever. And we, all of us, or the bunch of us working on them, just thought this actually is brilliant for prepping for the big one. And as well as that, I think, you know, and these are things that are very close to my heart, which is why probably I want to talk about it. If you look at, for instance, the ensemble actors in the company, like Rory, Aaron Monaghan, Garrett, all these, Marty Ray, all these people have been working together more or less, you know, for the last 10 years. And so much of the work of the rehearsal of these plays have been done not over the last 4 months, but over the last 10, 20 years. And I don't think you could have a hope of approaching them because they're big plays, they're big things to take on. And I don't think you'd any hope of approaching them with a sense of getting to the heart of them if we didn't have that history together. And that's where, for me, you know, the sense of Beckett, O'Casey, Singh. I mean, my God, what a treasure of writing for the theatre we have in Ireland. It's extraordinary.
Thank you very much. Anybody else like to ask questions down the front, please? So we're right in the front row here. If you just hang on for a sec.
This is an awful question for Garry Hynes, but I've got to ask it. Was there anything in terms of the audience reaction that you saw and you thought, my God, I didn't know the audience was going to react like that? In other words, was it revelatory in any way?
I've got to say, not pretending I'm a know-all, no. If there might have been times that they laughed. They didn't laugh at something that I thought was funny, but it's rare enough. For me, the best thing. Well, it's the best thing about theatre generally, but for me, the best thing is the audience's absolute ability to go in there at 1 o'clock and say, right, I'm here, and I'm going to sit here till 10:30. Do it to me.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic. It's just fantastic. And if you do see them lean forward in the seat, or you do see they're not falling asleep, and you do see that they're reacting, and then when they come out, they're talking about it. I mean, what better? It's like all my Christmases come together.
I actually thought that was a great question, in fact, because it hits something that I've seen time and time again with productions of O'Casey plays, which is where you start getting the nervous laughter in the audience when they know they shouldn't be laughing at something, but it's become so over the top that it gets ridiculous, and that's when it starts to unravel. And there might be times when the audience didn't laugh when they should have laughed, but there were no times when they did laugh.
No.
They shouldn't have laughed. And I think that's a real measure of the achievement, actually, in terms of keeping that tone so controlled and having it perfect for the audience.
Because you can really hear exactly what you said. You can really hear when an audience are actually not connecting.
Yeah.
They're trying to, they're wishing they could, but they're not. And it is characterised by nervous spits of laughter. Never the whole audience together, just various areas, and it throws the rhythm of the play. Just
And the mad scenes and all that stuff.
exactly,
You know.
exactly.
I think, you know, just the clarity. I mean, just to take one example here is I've seen so many terrible presentations of Bessie Burgess.
Yeah.
Where you don't get the play because you just can't understand how does this horrible creature then become the heroine of the play, you know, which is O'Casey's one of his most brilliant pieces of dramaturgy. But you don't get that unless somehow that seriousness has been brought back into the early scenes. So even when she is this kind of comic caricature, there's something else going on.
Absolutely.
I think that's where this pays off. Sorry, there was, yes, please, in the middle there, thank you.
Yeah, the moment when Bessie approaches Nora after she's been thrown onto the street, and the level at which she has to negotiate with her eyes and just without words to say, can I pick you up? Can I, you know, it's
Thank you very much.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, you've spoken a lot about each scene, but could you speak more about the transitions between, because I think you played quite creatively with them, you know, in the Plough and the Stars when they were putting away the breakfast table and the stagehand drinks from the cup of tea, it created such a flawless transition. If you could just speak to that.
I could. You know, obviously one of the challenges of the whole thing was 4 changes, small change in Shadow, and then 3 changes in Juno, and that was a big ask. So the creator of making that be a challenge that could be achieved, reasonably achieved, is the designer. The level at which the flats are designed, that they roll, they move perfectly, but they can also be fixed into the ground when they're fixed. And then the extraordinary technical team who realised Francis's vision in that way. That's, you know, like we had only a limited amount of time to tech this. We had to be able to achieve these changes in a certain very limited amount of time, as is always the case. And, you know, Druid is very lucky to have those kind of resources and people that help realise the ambition of doing the trilogy of plays.
We have time for just one more question. I think. Thank you.
An observation.
Sorry, would you mind taking the mic? Thank you.
At the start of your exchanges, you referenced the unique character of the 3 plays produced by O'Casey. The reflection that came to me was that what Druid have done with Druid Singh and Druid O'Casey is paralleled by Aeschylus and the Orestia.
Yeah.
and the contribution of Druid to our self-understanding as an establishing state is very, very considerable.
Thank you very much. I'll tell you just a very small, quick story about it. I mean, obviously we'd start with Druid singing and everything like that, and then finally I went to Tom Murphy, and I said, Tom, can I do these 3 plays together on the one day? He said, yes, you can, but I'm not calling it Druid Murphy. I said, of course I'm not calling it Druid Murphy, not at all. And then 6 months later, I think he's going to have to be Druid Murphy. Yeah, he's going to have to be Druid Murphy.
Well, I think it's a great parallel you draw. You know, in most other contexts, people say, come on, that's ridiculous. You know, can we really compare ourselves to, you know, the foundation of Western theatre in ancient Greece? I think it's an absolutely valid comparison. And I mean, it reminds me finally of, you know, there's that wonderful line in Murphy's The Geely Concert about, you know, that you and I are alive in time at the same time. That's the wonder of theatre. Great theatre makes us feel that we are alive in time at the same time as these fictional people who themselves are from a past, you know, 100 years ago. Nobody, I think, does that for us so superbly, so repeatedly, so unfailingly as Garry Hynes does, as Druid does. That's